Thanks. Again, my name is Alan Gilbert, and for the last 10 years, I've been involved in an organization that has issues that I saw myself thinking about as I was watching the film. So that's one of the things that struck me as I was watching this. I was struck by how movements of almost any kind, political, social, moral, religious, I'm sure as well, are made up of different kinds of people who are working in different ways, hopefully, if they want to be effective, towards the same goal, but each one bringing a different set of skills, a different set of interests, and a different style of working. And I've come to accept that as one of the real challenges that you find in organizations for which there's no reason that you're doing your work other than that you believe in it. There are many jobs you get that you choose to do the work, but it's a little bit different when you're committed to some sort of a social goal. You're not really, you don't come up through the ranks of some pecking order. You're not elected. You don't get a calling like you would in the priesthood. Although I guess you could think of it as a different calling. But I think there's something about working in the nonprofit world that creates dynamics that can be rather bruising and demand a lot of the people involved to work together and to realize that it's not about you, it's about the goals that you're trying to reach together. And that's sometimes really hard, and I saw that theme come through a lot. There are a lot of bits of history that we could talk about and that I certainly thought about. Everything from the beginning of the civil rights movement, the riots in the mid-60s, the spring of 1968, which I think in many ways was probably the pivot for not only the transition from the 60s to the 70s, but kind of a pivot for a generation and actually for the whole country. I kept thinking when I watched this film, what's it like to have both Richard Nixon and Donald Rumsfeld think well of you? I think today most of us would probably think, if I told you you're going to watch a movie that both Donald Rumsfeld and Richard Nixon thought the subject was a pretty good guy, you probably wrinkle your noses and say, I'm not going to be interested in that. But the fact that both of those people did, and the fact that Young accomplished so much, I think tells you how difficult it is to evaluate what kind of a leader he was and what his accomplishments were. And that brings me to my final point. One of the things that's interesting about this film, I'm not sure if you realized it, but the film was made by his niece. It was written and produced by his niece. So I think whenever you have a situation like that, you begin to think of how did their family relationship influence the story that was told. Can I trust the story that was told as being true and representative? What's the conflict of interest? Did the filmmaker recognize that? How did she deal with it? So when I was watching the film, I was trying to factor in how that might have an effect on how Young was portrayed and how I was reacting to that portrayal. You're next, I think.
Well, let me say something about Alan Gilbert. He was an editor. Was a Sunday editor of the Times Argus?
Assistant Sunday editor.
So he calls me up one day and he said, "I'd like you to do 6 articles on your book, The Vermont Political Tradition." And previous to that, Alan, who we corresponded from, I've got letters that I still have, which you wrote from Germany. But at any rate, Alan asked me if I'd write those articles, and so I give Alan credit for the fact that the book was written, because those 6 articles turned out to be the first 3 or 4 chapters of the book, and so I owe the book to Alan, and I paid tribute to him in the book itself. So thank you. And,
well, thank you.
Subsequent to that, it was during that period since 1972 or 74. That's 26 years. I think it's 30 years that you've come to my classroom. And how long were you with it? When did you begin with the ACLU?
2004.
2004. But even before 2004,
before that,
I knew you. And you came to class before 2004. So I owe not only I tribute to Alan for the book, but also for his teaching, and the students learned so much from him. But those dates have a very special meaning for me. It was 1968 that I came to Johnson State College, and in those days there was a teacher shortage, and so the Vermont law was that if you promised to teach in a Vermont school for 2 years, you'd go tuition free, quite different from today's. And so it was a mini a grant that our servicemen received in 1946 at the end of World War II. It had somewhat the same effect. All the students that I taught in that class, their family had never gone to college. It opened a whole new vista for them. Not only did they become good teachers, but they became good principals, good superintendents, and leaders in state government. Many of them ran for the legislature. As a matter of fact, 64 of my students have run for the legislature, and 32 have won, but I think it was because that's what we talked about. In 1960, I remember very well the Kennedy election, and John F. Kennedy. I remember that he spoke in Burlington in 1960, at the Burlington Airport, and I remember that the debates that Kennedy had with Lyndon B. Johnson. And one time they had a delegation between Massachusetts and the Texas delegation met together during the convention, and so they both wanted to speak in their behalf. So Lyndon Johnson said, "You know, I presided over the Senate, and no one has ever presided over the Senate as well as I. I worked in 2, 3, and 4 in the morning to get majorities, and I finally got the legislation that I fought for and that we fought for." And so Kennedy got up and he said, I actually admire Lyndon B. Johnson tremendously. He did get important legislation passed, and he's so important in the U.S. Senate, he should remain there. But at any rate, that's my memory of the 1960 presidential election. And then 1962, Phil Hoff is elected. Phil Hoff is a strong Kennedy supporter. And I remember Hoff coming to the Johnson. He's trudging up a hill, this tall blonde person. And I'm just coming out of class, and he sticks out his hand. He says, "I'm Phil Hoff, I'm running for governor." And I said, "I'm Bill Doyle, I teach here. You want me to take you through the building?" They didn't say building because it only had one building in 1962. So we had a good relationship, and that led to his appointment of me for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So that's always fond memories of Hoff right from the beginning. And then, of course, in 1968, which Alan mentioned was somewhat of a defining year, the loss of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King's, or Bob Kennedy's, when he made his greatest hour was on the night of the assassination. He had been scheduled to speak in Detroit, and he was warned that there would be riots there and his life could be in danger. But he gave one of the very best speeches of his life there, so that's my memory of John F. Kennedy. And of course, he might have won the presidency had he not been assassinated. You can imagine two people assassinated in the same year. And then of course, as far as Whitney Young is concerned, and Nixon, Nixon did understand that Whitney Young knew all the power brokers, the influential people, and he knew that he knew that he's doing them a favor by explaining that the nation would be much stronger if the young people, including young blacks, could go to institutions of higher education and have opportunities. And I saw that many of the schools that I knew about, Harvard, some of the colleges that you know about, Alan, all had programs. They made sure that they would reach into different communities, and maybe the person didn't have a perfect record in scores, but they picked out prominent people from a high school who could be a leader. So I just always remember how that germ led to the young blacks who went to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and good schools became leaders of their community. And I think Whitney Young, it really is, that was his great gift to convince the leaders they were acting in their own interest to help young blacks get ahead. So I'll yield my time.
My name is Ken Dean. I live in Montpelier part of the time, and a native Vermonter. Went to Harvard Union when I was younger. I spent a lot of time in California. As mentioned in the intro, I was a comparative religion major in college, spent a lot of time in monasteries, but worked on a number of presidential campaigns and understand politics pretty well, and particularly also Gandhian nonviolence. So what happens, and I'm glad that Alan's here as a civil liberties lawyer, and Bill Doyle is a wonderful college and politics professor for government history and politics. I want to give you a couple of other layers to make the mosaic more radiant, because there's a time when transcendence hits history and mountains move very fast. And Martin Luther King had a great insight about this, but I will preface it by the uniqueness of Whitney Young. And I have a doctor friend who I asked one day, how does Baraspin work differently than ibuprofen versus Aleve versus Tylenol? And he says, well, they kind of go after the same thing, but one medicine goes at the very center of the cell, works inside the cell, and then moves from the center of the cell out. And another medicine works on outside of the cell, surrounds the cell, works from that angle, and works in. And so it's a different approach, reaching a very similar and harmonious goal. Obviously, Whitney Young was a person who was, there are many meadows and pastures for social change and social transformation, and he lots of apostles and disciples who know their pasture and are very good shepherd for their task. Whitney Young knew how to work at the centers of power. He wasn't a flamboyant firebrand like Malcolm X or Stokely Carmichael or H. Rap Brown, who had their role in their meadow, in their pasture, and they were good at what they did. This person that we saw was with Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy and Richard Nixon and corporate presidents, is trying to activate, which he learned from Martin Luther King, who got it from Tolstoy, is about activating the conscience of the people, of the leaders, and the nation. And when the conscience is activated, things can move quickly. So a lot of us perhaps didn't know that much about Whitney Young until we saw the movie, because he didn't get all the press that some of his peers did. But he was the quiet, unsung hero, day in and day out, doing the practical stuff. And that's invaluable in any movement that creates social change. I want to talk about a little bit about his relationship with Martin Luther King. Obviously, Martin Luther King was always going for the moral ground. Lyndon Johnson was very uncomfortable with Martin Luther King. Whitney Young knew nuts and bolts politics. We'll get this senator a vote by going on this approach. What hit me during the movie is a few blocks from here at the Capitol, Abraham Lincoln's playing. And of course, many of you have seen that movie. and it's about the abolition of slavery in that vote, and how to come up with 20 votes that weren't to be had, but they had to be required to get this passed. So that's 1865 approximately. So 100 years later, in 1965, this film that we saw, that what happened when slavery was abolished and the whole process of racial integration occurred in the history of the United States. And so this is the sequel movie is at Kellogg-Hubbard Library tonight. But I wanted to mention one thing that you probably don't know, and I won't get too terribly esoteric. I'll do one more esoteric thing if you want this more substantial. But Martin Luther King was really kind of the pastor for that inner circle. He was their leader, but he certainly was the clergyman. And he certainly came from a multitude of sources, not just Baptist and New Testament. He was highly influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. And by being influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King was a very good student of the Bhagavad Gita, which is the New Testament for the Hindu tradition. It's about 70 pages. But he's also highly influenced by a person by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a contemporary Protestant, progressive, liberal theologian of the day. And it was Niebuhr and Gandhi that Martin Luther King put together, integrated them, and that was his magic. And I'll explain to it, and this will all resonate from your knowledge of him. Niebuhr had a particular book called The Nature and Destiny of Man. And the whole question was the man and humanity transcendent, or were they finite by nature? And the finite advocates were people like Freud and Marx, that man's kind of limited, there's kind of an innate sense of perhaps some deception and some real high state of original sin. The transcendent schools of thought were people like Emerson and Thoreau, that there's an angelic nature to us, and we're benevolent, and we're kind, and perhaps a social conditioning that takes away from our natural state. So the question is, what was humanity? Was it one or the other? And Niebuhr said it's both. The humanity is both transcendent and finite, and at the same time. This was very powerful for Martin Luther King. So when you read his speeches, be it I Have the Dream speech, or his letter from Birmingham jail, or all of his work, he is working with Carl Jung archetypes of hitting the transcendent and the finite in every sentence, in every paragraph, and almost every phrase. And I'll give you an example. And the same pattern will exist, that the sons of slaves and the sons of slave masters are both held in bondage and both need to be made free in a single step. That addresses the finite reality and the transcendent reality. And he was so powerful of not hitting just the conscious mind, but the unconscious mind of what needed to happen. So between 58 and 68 in 10 years, things happened very fast. And if we have time, John Lewis in this movie called Eyes on the Prize, he was on videotape really talking about how the Bhagavad Gita offended Martin Luther King in his conversation with Robert Kennedy one day, which was very key. But I'll just quote something from the Upanishads that Martin Luther King took to heart. And it goes something to the fact that the spirit standing still is quicker than the mind. The spirit without moving can overtake those who run. So this Gandhian influence, this Eastern spirituality in this young Southern Baptist minister, also influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr, that was a huge part of his work, and also Whitney Young had a taste of this by being a pal of Martin Luther King, and that's part of the deeper mosaic that makes the mountain move.
Are there any questions or comments for the panelists?
The biography of Hopp has got a chapter on civil rights in Vermont.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to tell you what's in there because you better than I do. But that's the same period as Whitney Young is working. Is there a connection? Can you talk about Whitney Young in Vermont?
I don't know that there is a connection.
I
mean,
don't
direct
know
connection.
of the connection, but obviously they both thought it's along the same lines, but I didn't know whether they knew each other personally.
You know, one thing that there is a connection about, last year I was doing some research at the state library. I was trying to figure out why a certain bill that actually had the implications of this bill had come up again in 2012, and the bill had originally been passed in 1968. So I went over to the state library and I started looking at Rutland Heralds from the spring of 1968 when I figured the legislature would be meeting. I lived through that period, and I had forgotten, I hadn't realized, but I was suddenly struck by what an incredibly tumultuous time the 4 months from January to April were. And if you want to have an interesting experience and you have the time, just put on the microfilm over at the State Library someday and look at the front pages of the Rutland Herald for those 4 months. Because you see Phil Hoff starting the year by being supportive of Johnson and still in favor of the Vietnam War. And you get to the end of March, beginning of April, and Phil Hoff has come out against Lyndon Johnson. He's come out against the Vietnam War. He and the Vermont legislature are fighting just tooth and nail. And some of the conflict between Hoff and the legislature was indeed over racial issues. I mean, by that time you'd had the incident at Island Pond. No, I'm sorry, not Island Pond, but Irisburg. Right, the Irisburg affair. And you had Hoff bring kids from Harlem and the inner cities of New Jersey, such as Newark, up to Vermont in the summertime, which caused a lot of backlash. People thought that's really not how you were supposed to bring about integration. Hoff was this state, not to the same extent that other places in the country, but certainly Hoff was living the kinds of conflicts that you saw expressed in this film. I mean, the Vietnam War really had a much bigger effect than our losing it or being for or against it. It really did derail. I mean, just the sheer economics of it made Johnson's War on Poverty, the Great Society, impossible to really finish and do the whole job. It would have been like the Marshall Plan stopping halfway through because the U.S. just didn't have the money to fund it anymore.
So it's sort of like the Great Society died in the jungles of Vietnam.
Yeah, to some extent.
Whitney Young had an influence on the Hoff administration in one sense, and it had to do with a person named Benjamin Collins. The Kerner-Lindsey report came out in '68, talking about a great deal of unrest in the urban areas. It was that report where Governor Hoff took that inspiration and created what was called the Vermont New York City Youth Project that Alan was just speaking of. And that was in the summer of '68 and the summer of '69 at Linden State, at Johnson State UVM, and in one case in 1969 at Saxon's River, Vermont Academy, because I was a high school freshman then, and I was a participant in the New York City Vermont Youth Project. Ben Collins, who was Secretary of Civil and Military Affairs during the Hoff administration, really became the director of the New York City Vermont Youth Project and had lots of funding. And there were a number of black leaders who came for a symposium that was held in the well of the House chamber. Vermont Public Television has a very good documentary on this, which they played years ago, but not recently. And so Governor Hoff wanted to do what he could in Vermont, and it was really to a little bit deeper, because obviously black students, high school youth primarily, some college freshmen, came to Vermont to mingle with us Vermonters. And it was about a 6 or 8 week program. But also the Vermonters were part of it for the visiting New Yorkers and the young Vermonters was their own self-development, their own self-awakening, their own civic responsibility, getting to know our universe, getting to know each other, a multitude of things. It was a watershed experience for anyone who participated, and there's some great films on it. But Whitney Young had a great influence on Benjamin Collins. Ben Collins had to gather a lot of funding. He did make trips to Washington. Funding came from 4 or 5 different sources, and Whitney Young was very helpful for him to get that budget for 1968 and the 1969 programs. And then in 1970, Phil Hoff ran for the U.S. Senate.
So I guess my memories of Phil Hoff, when he's elected, the legislature is 2-1 Republican, and that really didn't make any difference to Hoff. He selected people who thought were the best people to work in his administration, and very much was accomplished in the friendships between maybe these 12 people that they would meet annually. Maybe 6 or 7 were Democrats, 7 were Republican, but they were friends for life. But he took on some very tough issues that we're still thinking about. School district consolidation was and back in 1966 proposed 12 school districts. We're still discussing that issue today, aren't we, Al?
We are.
So he was a visionary who had the personality and knew how to, almost immediately when he met somebody, he knew instinctively that person had a role to play in his administration.
Sure.
I don't know if you were aware, you were talking about alternative influences on Martin Luther King.
Well, I think the term may be a multitude of different influences.
Yeah.
You know, he was a clergyman, he was a theological student, and that he wasn't just a political activist, and he was a...
No, I was just going to bring up one other that you might want to look into, and that was the friendship between Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel. And they were very close and learned a lot from each other. And as a matter of fact, King and his family were going to the Heschels for Passover, which was a few days after he was killed. And I think the influence, if you read Heschel's works about Vietnam, for instance, he got a lot of hell from his own people for what he was writing.
They were very close. They were very, very close. And if you watch the March on Selma, Abraham Joshua Heschel kind of had a white hair with a goatee, and his head was kind of a thin fellow, kind of bobbing up and down.
Yeah.
And he was a huge influence. One of the great passages, and Abraham Joshua Heschel was one of the great rabbis. He also has a little history for Vermont, which I'll mention in a second. He was very key for a Vermont chapter. But in terms of Martin Luther King would often quote Heschel's definition of redemption, and that redemption requires 3 things. God, a soul, and a moment in time. And they're very, very close. Abraham Joshua Heschel was very key in founding Weston Priory, a Benedictine monastery here in Vermont. The early founder of that was a Benedictine monk from Germany who was in Jerusalem at the time of World War II, where Heschel was there in World War II. And because they felt it was safer to stay there, Abraham Joshua Heschel and this German Benedictine monk became buddies, soul brothers. And then at the end of the war, Heschel came to New York City. The Benedictine monk arrived in New Jersey. There was a family in Weston that says, we have a farm, we'd like to give it to you. You can make it a monastery. They did. It's Weston Priory today. Heschel would come up frequently and spend time with the monks at Weston Priory. And his daughter is a professor at Dartmouth College. And she actually is very close with Toby Wiseman, who's a rabbi here that lives in Loomis Street, happens to be my next door neighbor. And so the Heschel influence is very wonderful and profound, and a huge impact on Martin Luther King, huge.
So I just want to add a little bit about Hoff and his great admiration for John F. Kennedy. He worked hard for his Kennedy Caring Vermont, but and during the Kennedy administration, they had many talks together. But the one thing I do remember about John F. Kennedy, his sense of humor. I remember, and I think 2 months before his assassination, this is 1963, and so he was wonderful at meet the press. These press conferences were the best press conferences of any president I know of, how it could deal with it. This was a press conference, and one of the veteran reporters said to Kennedy, what do you think of Barry Goldwalder's chances to winning in 1964? And Kennedy, he paused for a moment. He said, well, I noticed that last Monday he insulted the King of Greece. And then 2 days later he came out against Social Security when he's speaking to Tennessee Valley Authority. And then in Florida, he came out against Social Security. And so he said, Goldwater has had such a bad week, it's not fair to me to comment.
What did you folks think about the film in terms of the image it portrayed of Young? Did you think about that at all? Did you think it was complete? Were there questions you had about what he was like and what his effectiveness was? Just sort of curious.
I thought it was fascinating from beginning to end. I thought there were pearls of wisdom. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is fear.
Yeah.
And there's this theme of fear that lurks behind both sides of these peoples. And it expresses itself in different ways and in different personalities. And I think it's an ongoing story. Seeing this film, it's kind of an introduction almost to, or maybe at least a second chapter. I think it started with Lincoln.
How did you feel when you learned at the end of the film that Young died, at the age of 49 in 1971? I mean, did that surprise you, or did you know that already?
The fact that he had a heart attack.
Yeah, and he was relatively young.
Yeah, I mean, he was young. He had a heart attack. But at least he wasn't assassinated.
Yeah, that's true. If you got through those years
Probably missed it by a week.
without being assassinated, that's horrible to say, but it's really true, isn't it?
As far as we know, he wasn't assassinated.
As far as we know. One of the feelings I got when the film just all of a sudden ends was, where's the other half? You know, what's sort of the second part of his life where he's recognized or there's some new development? Because I think most of us are not used to somebody of his standing and his character and his ambition all of a sudden just not being on the scene. He dies at the age of 49. You know, most of us are, Hillary Clinton is how old, and she might run for president in 4 years. It's kind of unbelievable. And this guy was sort of cheated out of another part of his life that he might have gone on and done very surprising things, or maybe nothing. So I sort of felt that I wanted his life to continue just because I wanted to see how history would affect him and what he did.
Well, it would be great in conversation with Kennedy and Hoff, Whitney Young. That would have been a good discussion. Well, one thing that Kennedy and Hoff had was their interest in unions, and they had great support from unions and the nation for Kennedy and the state for Hoff. But I just left a union affair, didn't I, tonight? Didn't we meet tonight?
Sure did.
Maybe you'd want to comment on. I'm so pleased you came.
Oh, thank you. You know what I think.
Was this the VSCA?
Yes.
Yes. Well, what I thought this film portrayed well was the fact that these leaders all had the same goal and the same purpose, but they took it from different angles, and each had their own personality and their own manner in which to achieve the same goal. You have Martin Luther King, you have Stokey, you have so many others, as well as, of course, Whitney. And I thought that was portrayed well. That there was not necessarily any wrong way.
Right.
There were just different ways. And each of them needed each other to progress, because Whitney was able to handle the White House, Martin just appealed, broadly to everyone. Stokey, he appealed to the college-age student. And I thought that's what this film portrayed well. Yeah.
The other thing I thought was really interesting about this film, I don't know if you watched the credits at the end, but if you looked who helped to fund the film, it was mainly corporations. Yeah, which I thought in many ways was very appropriate. I'm not trying to be sarcastic, but I think many corporations really at that time worked with Whitney Young to do what they believed was the right thing. And I gather that's really where the concept of affirmative action began. It was with some of Whitney Young's ideas about how much was owed to people who had been disenfranchised for so many years. So that, along with the domestic Marshall Plan, which I thought was a great phrase. I'd never heard that before. I thought that was really, really interesting.
No, it's a good calling it the domestic Marshall Plan is a good way to show it clearly for what it was really intended to be.
Yep.
As Alan was talking about Whitney dying at age 49, during that entire time period, just 6 people come to mind. Medgar Evers was killed in June of '63. Malcolm X died by assassination in February of '65. Martin Luther King in April of '68. John Kennedy in November of '63. Bobby Kennedy June of '68, and then Whitney Young died of apparent heart attack in March of '71. So they all died quite young. Many in their 30s or 40s, obviously. And it struck me another 2 or 3 points, but I used to work in Belfast, Northern Ireland, with the peace process, and the intramural struggles that happens in both camps. That becomes sometimes more fierce than the two polarities squabbling with each other. And obviously, in the civil rights struggle, there are some frictions in the group. What I found unique about this social change movement as a lifetime lesson for current time, which Whitney Young was the best apostle, was he didn't have enemies in the normal sense. When Martin Luther King and John Lewis and Andrew Young can be his buddies and his pals, but he also has the respect of Lyndon Johnson and Donald Rumsfeld and Richard Nixon. He really knows what it is to love your enemy. Stay principled, stay clear, awaken conscience, be a particle of light, be a warrior for that light, but love your enemy as yourself. And there's no us against them, and there's no demonization. And I think in current struggles of social change, that as soon as the demonization ceases and is quieted, and we respect the goodness that we can find in our adversary and our opponent, and find threads that are common to bring a greater light, then mountains move quickly, which these folks embodied masterfully. And I think that's one key lesson I think Martin Luther King and Whitney Young demonstrated in an untold way. And I think Mahatma Gandhi was really at the center of that. And there's a great story about John Lewis and Martin Luther King and Whitney Young. It occurred in 1961, and John Kennedy had just become president. When you see the documentary Eyes on the Prize, it was on PBS a number of years ago, it's a very poignant moment in this film where John Lewis and Martin Luther King and Whitney Young and others are in a room talking about the Congress, the Senate, the courts, Alabama, the bus boycotts, restaurants, all the struggles. The police, governors, the entire thing. It's an afternoon, full-day meeting. It's gone on for 6 or 7 hours. Martin Luther King hasn't said one word. So Whitney Young and John Lewis go over to him, and they go, Martin, you haven't said a single word in 6 hours. Like, where are you? We have a lot here, and you have said not one syllable. Where are you? And Martin Luther King gets very, very quiet. He looks at Whitney Young, he looks at John Lewis, and he says, what type of soul do you think Robert Kennedy has? And then John Lewis says, you mean like, his personality? And Martin Luther King goes, no. What type of soul lives in the man? And then John Lewis goes, you mean like his values? And Martin Luther King goes, no. what type of soul lives in the man of Robert Kennedy? And then it gets really quiet, and Whitney Young says, you mean like his modus operandi? It gets very quiet. Martin Luther King says, what type of soul lives in that man? And then more silence. And then Martin Luther King says, when a soul is touched by a great truth, what happens then? Politics then has to race to catch up with it. And then soon after that, Martin Luther King spent a lot of quality time, one-on-one, with Robert Kennedy, trying to discover the nature of his soul at its depth and to touch it with a great truth. And they made some success. And then Robert Kennedy became a pretty good attorney general, when to pull in his brother, when to keep his brother away, when to bring in the National Guard, when to do this, when to do that, and they became good peers. And the reference to this was really the Gandhian influence on Martin Luther King at deeper dimensions of how to look at social change.
Yeah, in retrospect, looking back and comparing Martin Luther King and Whitney Young, it almost seems that Whitney Young was maybe more powerful in a way. It was interesting that Martin Luther King failed to establish that rapport with Johnson, and that Young actually had this emotional reconciliation with this guy when he kind of came back and he made his presence known in the cabinet of the new President Nixon. It was like that sustaining vision. He was a sustainer. He kept it going. Martin Luther King, I guess, provoked the soul for us to aspire to the highest levels, metaphorically. But this guy was really doing the nuts and bolts work behind it all, and just to sustain it through that many presidencies, that many different characters, and that's really kind of the work that needs to be done. I think King was kind of a prophet in a way, but it's the kind of people that can communicate and just work with other people. That's when progress is made. I thought it was sad that King pulled away from the president at that point from Johnson. He said there's something I can't communicate with Johnson about, and I'll go in a different direction. I thought that was a little sad.
Yeah, I thought that Johnson didn't understand the genius of Martin Luther King, and he didn't have the smarts to recognize. And John F. Kennedy, when King was in jail in the South, made that famous telephone call. And that's the difference in a way between Kennedy and Johnson. Johnson never could have made that phone call. But I guess in a larger sense, Whitney Young's legacy is that he in a way had a lot to do with the social revolution of the 1960s that still goes on today. Maybe without Whitney Young, we wouldn't have had a black president, wouldn't have many black leaders and mayors and so on. And we wouldn't have had as many young women running for office. Look what's happened today when with each passing year, more women are elected to Congress. And as Alan said, that Hillary Clinton is now being thought of, as most people think, if she ran for president, she'd have a very good chance. So it's not only young whites and young blacks, but young women who benefited from Whitney Young's leadership, because they were able to go to college to discover something that they'd never seen before and bring that discovery of truth back to their own communities and become leaders in their own community.
You know, the one thing that I thought you might mention was the story of Whitney Young's father running the school in Kentucky. His ruse, you know, he's supposed to be running a school where black kids are learning to be what black Americans are supposed to do. You know, be porters on trains and work in the kitchen and scrub the dishes and wash the clothes, kind of thing. But he's got another idea. You know, he's going to take the white people's money, but then he's going to give his students the best education they can get in math and science and law and business or whatever. And he wants them to go on to be the professionals that the white people who are giving him the money don't particularly want them to be. And he even goes to the point of if benefactors are coming for the day, he sends some of the students out to the fields to cultivate crops, like, oh yeah, we're just doing your work, sir. And I think there's a pattern of progress that is often hard to see because one seems so much more dramatic than the other. Whitney Young seems to be so much more ambitious and progressive and more of a leader than his dad. But I think in some ways his dad was a truly amazing man for his time. And I think Whitney Young's mother too. We didn't hear all that much about her, but she sounded like an amazing person too. So I'm always fascinated by the people who came before the person that we're all focused on, because I think sometimes they're the ones who bear the real story.
In history, you often get a 2x2 duo. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had a healthy friction that really gave birth to different insights about American liberties and our future. St. Peter and St. Paul had frictions. And obviously Martin Luther King and Whitney Young had great respect and great bond, but they were different disciples for different pastures. Martin Luther King was really the aspiration, the inspiration, the moral ground, and played the broad stroke cosmology. The I Have a Dream speech is a huge upliftment, but a massive paradigm shift. And it's really, in my terms, hitting the archetypes of the unconscious. People are moved by that, not knowing sure really why. It's much deeper than what they could consciously grasp. Whitney Young was a nuts and bolts fellow. He was the rivet person. So Johnson loved him. Johnson didn't want to hear about a lot of moral arguments about Vietnam or this. He needed some votes to pass this piece of legislation, and where does he get them? And he wasn't quite concerned how morally the votes were acquired. He just wanted the votes. He wanted it passed, and Whitney Young could work that reality. Martin Luther King was one step removed from that. He really was a Southern Baptist.
10 steps.
10 steps.
Yeah. I think the thing that it was mentioned a number of times at the beginning that shows us why Whitney Young was so effective, and his father was. You say they weren't the same. I'd say they were acting very much the same, father and son. Pragmatism. And that really appealed to LBJ because he was a pragmatist, and that's all. None of this, spiritual stuff. The hell with it. Now, I recognize this very clearly because I'm both a pragmatist and I work in the field of healing. And they say, how do you know that this works and that will be good for that? I said, I tried it and it worked. You tried it on yourself? That's not the point. The point is, a pragmatist just says, will it work? If it works, it's okay. A spiritual person will say, what's the morals behind this? Why are we doing this? What do we need to accomplish heaven on earth? Of course, they're both trying to accomplish heaven on earth, and they got a very different way of doing it. I also see the father doing the same thing within his much more cloistered sphere, because the money would have stopped if he had changed the program and let the contributors.
Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned John Lewis.
You saw him on TV last night.
What?
You saw him on TV last night. If you
I don't
watch,
have a TV. I didn't see it.
if you
John
watch,
Lewis, is that anything to John L. Lewis? That's labor leader from a long time ago. Who was John Lewis?
John Lewis was the leader of the Students for Nonviolent
Coordinating.
Coordinating Committee. You saw him in this film. He was here. And he's currently a congressman from Georgia. And actually, he challenged Julian Bond, another person you saw in the film, who was one of Martin Luther King's inner circle disciples. And they were in a primary. John Lewis won the primary. And he was he really galvanized the students through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And Stokely Carmichael succeeded him as kind of the next phase of it. John Lewis was very wedded to Gandhi nonviolence, and other leaders that came after, not as much. There was a little waning of that.
Oh, they did mention it.
And then last night when President Obama gave his State of the Union, John Lewis was very prominent. You could see him with the president and others.
You know, it's someone like this that is a refreshing reminder. Sometimes it takes, a courageous person to reveal truths that we're blind to in our everyday life. It's always just refreshing to see someone who kind of sees reality in a way that is real. And it's really an aspiration. It's really a story of aspiration and heroism.
So
That's a great note to end on.
I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank our panelists. And if any of you want to watch more of the movie, it will be on Vermont Public Television. As I said, I think Independent Lens is on Sunday nights at 11.
Could I just say thank you very much for this program and enjoyed the panelists very much. And Whitney Young would have loved to have had dinner with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. I'll tell you why, because they wrote each other, and they both died in 1826, but for 20 years they corresponded with each other. You see any of those leaders in Washington today writing letters to each other today? I mean, it's a totally different picture.
But they had stopped writing letters for 20 years.
Right, but they made up for
There's
another
hope.
20.
Yeah, there's hope.
There is hope.
Thank you.
Very much.
That's good.